On today's episode, I'm joined by Jacob Morrow and Miles Neville, and we're talking how to zero a rifle and how not to zero a rifle. We'll walk you through different tiers. We start with kind of an entry-level hunting rifle setup, then we walk through a precision hunting rifle setup, all the way up to a competition rifle and how to get those rifles properly zeroed and some of the pitfalls that some of the people seem to fall in. And then we end the show with how they zero their thermal optics for night hunting. This one was great to talk to these guys and get their insight. We hope you enjoy it.
I'm Joyce Hornady. You might say accuracy is my business. I make bullets.
You are listening to the Hornady Podcast.
Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the Hornady Podcast. I'm your host, Seth, and today, across the table from me, I have Ballistician, Jacob Morrow, and Project Engineer, Miles Neville. Guys, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good morning.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Top of the morning. Now, before we get started on today's topic, you might notice we're in a little long sleeve action. Well, it's 57 degrees this morning out at the Swerzik property, and we got these really nice quarter zip, little dark camouflage action. Check them out at hornadygear.com if you guys are interested in wearing some of this stuff. But the day's a little bit colder in the morning, and I'm starting to get pretty excited for hunting season. That is something that it just makes the world go round in our office here. It really does. And with that, I start getting real nitpicky with some of my equipment and my gear because we've got hunts that are starting to get planned and coordinated. And I want to make sure all my lowercase j's are dotted. And one of those things is zeroing a rifle and making sure that you have a really good zero so that you can stretch the legs if you need to and you can hit what you're aiming at, because nobody likes to shoot and miss what they're aiming at. So I want to walk through with you guys and get your opinion on zeroing a rifle, and maybe more so how not to zero a rifle. And I want to walk through a couple different tiers. Let's talk about the guy that gets a brand new rifle. You go to the gun store and maybe it's got a scope on it from, you buy a package deal or something. Let's walk that guy through how to zero the rifle and how not to zero it. And then maybe transition to maybe more of a precision hunter. We have a precision hunter line of ammunition, right? And that's for hunting at all practical ranges. So you might have to stretch the legs a little bit. How do you zero that rifle? How do you work with barrel heat if you're trying to shoot higher round counts? And then we'll go to the PRS guy, the competitive shooter. How do you guys zero that rifle? Because in that competition, you are really pushing the boundaries of distance and precision. And you have to know if the reason you missed, was it wind? Was it an elevation problem? Or was it just simply you have an off zero? We'll talk about that. And then if we have time, I'd really like to get your guys' opinion on thermal zeroing. That's something that you guys both do quite often. I know you do together. And that's kind of a new arena. It's not new per se, but it's becoming way more mainstream because the cost of entry is slightly lower than it used to be. So let's dive into that if you guys are game. Let's start with, you go to Sportsman's Warehouse, you buy the package deal, you get your Savage with a factory 3-9 scope bolted on there for you in 6.5 Creedmoor. You grab a couple boxes of ammo off the shelf. Out the door you go. What are you guys going to do to zero that rifle? Because I know I have witnessed this at a public range where that exact thing happened. Guy sits down, blasts his first shot off at 100 yards, and then is asking anybody if they saw where it went and why there's no hole in the paper.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the first thing I do anytime, any rifle, regardless of budget or whatever the application is, especially if it comes as a package deal in a store, rip all of it apart and go through from the scope mount, the base on the receiver, tighten all the screws all the way through, and look for the manufacturer's, torque specs. But make sure that your bases are tight to the receiver, for one. Make sure that your rings are tight to the bases if they're a separate unit. And then make sure your scope cap rings are tight, but not crushing the scope tube tight.
Yep. And level.
Yeah, and make sure your scope is level. And I guess we can get into that a little. Well, so you're using your scope to adjust for gravity if you're doing long range shooting. And that may or may not be applicable to this budget scenario. But whichever you're going to use, whether it's the reticle or the scope, or the elevation turret. They should theoretically be on the same axis, but not always. So whichever one you're going to be using is the one that needs to be level with gravity, because you're adjusting for gravity. So make that level with gravity.
Right on.
And a lot of people just level it to the base underneath, level it to the rifle, make it all straight up and down. That's fine. But then if you know that you don't hold the rifle straight up and down, it's really no big deal to level the scope level while you hold the rifle crooked.
Especially for traditional range type scenarios. You're talking 300 yards and in, maybe even 400.
Yeah. And for 300 yards and in, you could probably just do a basic level off the rail or whatever, and you'll probably be fine. You're not.
Yeah.
If you're not adjusting for elevation, if you know the deer come across at 126 yards from my heated, stand with my lazy boy sitting in there and eating pancakes the whole time.
Dude, that sounds like goose hunting, not deer hunting.
But if that's what you know is going to happen, though, every single time it's going to be less than 200-yard shot, then it's even less of an issue. If you're not ever going to adjust your elevation turret or anything like that, then don't sweat over it.
Yeah, get it level. If you have a variable you can control it. So you're saying start off with mechanically make sure everything is got a proper fixture.
Yep. And then the next thing I'll do is bore sight it. I'll pull the bolt out and then set the rifle up on 2 sandbags and then look through the bore and point it at something at least 100 yards away. Okay. So pick an object that's like a street sign, something that's easily recognizable. Point it in a safe direction, obviously. Like whatever.
Or your target if you're at the range.
Yeah, target at the range is fine too. But point that and then look through the bore at whatever you have isolated and try to get that straight in line with the center of the bore. And then without moving anything, come back up and look through the scope and make sure that where the crosshairs are pointing is like pretty immediately in the area of the object that you're trying to point the bore at.
Yep. That's a big one. I think a lot of these package deals that you buy at Sportsman's Warehouse, they'll say laser bore sighted, which is convenient that they would do that. But I have seen some stuff that doesn't even hit in the same universe, or you bore sight it and you're like, wow, that's way off.
Yeah, and so there's scope over bore too. So if they bore sighted it at 25 yards against a wall, you're looking way low from that angle is going to shallow out the further out you go. So
and I think a lot of shooters, and maybe I'm speaking in generalities, but I feel like there are a lot of shooters that don't quite understand how simple bore sighting is, and that's the name is perfectly descriptive. You look down the bore. It's really nice if you have, like you said, 2 sandbags or maybe even a lead sled, which I'm not typically a fan of. But for this scenario, if you've got a lead sled or a bipod and some sort of eared rear bag that you can really get this thing dialed in with, then don't touch it and position it so that you're looking straight down the bore. Again, right at about 100 yards is perfect, and you can look through the scope without manipulating the rifle and adjust those turrets so that what you're seeing in the center of your bore is what you're seeing in the center of your scope.
Yeah, and even though it sounds somewhat intimidating but is really simple in concept, another really good alternative is just sighting in closer. Start out at 20, 25 yards, and you've got a lot bigger target not theoretically. It's going to have a bigger area to miss. Mm-hmm. So just fire a couple shots at 20, 25 yards and start walking that bullet in. And you want to set it up about 1 inch to 2 inches low, because that, again, your sight is going to be higher than your bore, so that's where that's coming from. But you get it set up so you're 1 inch or 2 inches low at 20 yards. You're going to be really close at 100, and you'll be able to dial it in from there. There's no shame in taking a couple shots closer to get it on paper. I'd rather do that than spend 5, 10, 20 shots at 100 going, I don't know where it went.
Right, and then after the fact, come back and go to 25 or 50
there's
yards
always
anyways.
That guy you see blasting rounds at 100 yards,
That's
not hitting the paper.
Never been any of us.
Yeah, right. Well, younger Seth, I'll share some stories about younger Seth zeroing rifles, but Jacob, to your point, I think, Miles, like you said, you get that bore sight, do it at 100 yards. With those rifles and, kind of a traditional range type hunting rifle, or even an AR-15 that I'm not going to shoot very far, I'll do that. I'll bore sight it at 100, and then I shoot it at 25, and I put it, 2 to 1 inch low at 25. Usually my first shots with a rifle when I'm trying to get it zeroed are at 25, and truthfully, whether that's one of my precision hunting rifles or one of my competition rifles, we've got a downstairs ballistics lab with a 25-yard tunnel and a 200-yard tunnel. My first stop is the 25-yard tunnel, and I put it about 1.5 inches low at 25 yards, and then I go over to the 100-yard side.
Yep, absolutely. Back when I was running the downstairs tunnel, that was one of the policies I had is if you didn't 100% have a 100-yard zero, you have to shoot in the 25-yard tunnel first, just because there's expensive equipment down there. You don't want to hit it.
Yeah, I was going to say, there is expensive equipment down there, and I don't want to be ricocheting stuff.
Exactly. Or bouncing it off the tunnel walls. Like, that's not a good thing.
No. So that 25-yard is really helpful. Take 1 or 2 shots is really all it takes to tell you where you're going to be. And then you can move on to that 100-yard or 200-yard if that's where you're headed and really start to dial it in. And one of the points I wanted to share, younger Seth with the 257 Roberts, Ruger M77. And I'm going back way younger Seth, like 12, 13-year-old Seth, shooting Hornady Light Magnum. And that rifle, I've said on this podcast, not particularly accurate. Accurate enough, but now that I'm in the world of accuracy, it's not, wouldn't cut the cheese here, but I would shoot one shot and then I'd make a correction. And then I'd shoot another shot and I'd make a correction. And I was making corrections off single shots. And I didn't know what I was doing. And what I was doing was shooting a 2 to 3 inch group, but I was making adjustments off the one shot where it landed.
Right.
And I'm guessing you guys have seen that as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Because not knowing any better, you think, well, if I was exactly the same and the shot broke the same, then they should all go into the same hole.
Yep.
And as Jaden explained in that one podcast we did, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, dispersion is a cone of fire, not a point of fire.
Yeah.
That's definitely a good. Once you've got it dialed in to about where you think it needs to be, that's when it's time to start shooting at 3, 5. I mean, it depends on application. I know, I always advocate as many as you can. 20 is what I usually do, regardless.
Yeah.
But I know not everybody can or wants to do that, or doesn't even really need to. If you're
I was going to say, in this application, we're
if you're
talking about a hunting
shooting
rifle.
deer-size vitals and you know it's going to be less than 200 yards, if you're off a quarter or a half minute, big deal. You know?
But definitely shoot a group of some kind,
right?
3, 5, whatever it is, before you make that correction. Because if you're shooting 1.5 minute groups, but you make a correction off of one shot, you might overcorrect, you might undercorrect, and then you're going to be even more confused.
Now there is definitely a circumstance where shooting one shot and correcting would be applicable. Say you're shooting and you're 12 inches off the bullseye. Definitely crank 12 minutes into your scope to get that where you think it should be centered up. Yeah. But once you're starting to get within probably 2-3 inches of the bullseye, that's a really good time to start shooting a 3 or a 5 shot group and then fine tuning your zero, because you're going to be wasting shots if you're shooting 5 and you're a foot off, because you need to come over.
Yeah. Another good thing too is get yourself just a big clean target.
Yeah.
There you go.
Because I know guys that have tried to go out and use the board that's still stuck on, from the last guy, and trying to differentiate your bullet holes from their bullet holes.
Don't worry about your ego. Put a new big sheet of cardboard up there with a fresh target.
Yep. Excellent. And one little trick, if you will, it's a pretty common trick, but so if you, like Jacob, you said, you make that gross adjustment if you're way off.
Yep.
Then you shoot a group and you're real close, but you're not perfect, but you're close. So you shoot a group. What you can do, especially if you've got a really good fixture to hold your rifle steady, is you can shoot your group and then aim at the center of the target and adjust your scope so that the reticle moves to the center of that group. And then when you shoot another group, you'll be right in there.
Yep. Back in the day when, young Jacob was shooting a duplex rifle, he didn't have that big mill hash mark to measure how far stuff was, and didn't want to have to call the range code to go down there and measure it to know exactly how many minutes to click over. That's exactly what I did. I'd either try to hold it as steady as I could and then click the turrets over till it lined up with that bullet hole, or I'd have a friend come over and dial the turrets for me while I was looking through the scope so I could tell them what way to go and when to stop.
Yeah, but that's a handy little trick to get you dialed in. So to summarize, kind of the everyman rifle, just a basic hunting rifle, smaller profile barrel, traditional range shot distances, no big giant fancy scope. Just bore sight it. Do it yourself. It's not hard to do. Get comfortable with bore sighting a rifle. So that'd be one thing. to take away. Just bore sight the rifle. It's easy. It costs nothing to do.
Yeah.
And it's going to save you some bullets, likely, from launching stuff downrange and not knowing where to hit. Number 2, like you said, Jacob, check the ego. It's okay to shoot 1 or 2 shots at 25 yards so that you can then move on and know you're going to hit with reasonable accuracy where you're aiming at 100 yards or 200 yards, wherever you pick to zero. And you can make single shot adjustments if they're way off, but once you get close, shoot a group so that when you make a correction, you know it's relative to the center of the group, not the center of one individual shot. And then you get an idea of how that rifle is actually going to perform and what the cone of fire you can expect on your hunting trip.
And I would say too, with like the more budget end rifles, that those barrels are most likely going to be a button barrel. I call it a factory grade button barrel. And you might want to let those cool off in between these groups. I wouldn't shoot more than maybe 5 to 10. You can try it out for yourself, but if you see things start going wonky after you shoot your 3rd or 4th or 5th shot, then just keep the barrel cool.
Yep. Those barrels like to be cool usually.
The small profile hunting rifles, absolutely shoot. Even if you want to shoot 3 shots, let it cool and then shoot back into your group. That's totally fine. You don't have to shoot all 10 or 20 at once.
Yeah. Right. So let's shift gears a little bit, sticking with that hunting rifle, but let's jump into maybe a little bit more of a precision hunting rifle. I think what comes to mind, the Springfield Waypoint 2020, for example. You've got the Ruger with the Hawkeye long range. You've got Christensen Arms with their carbon fiber barrels, Proof Research, all of these on-the-shelf rifles, the Remington 700 long range, the Remington Alpha 1, all these rifles, pick them up off the shelf, and they're built accordingly to provide some extended range type performance. And then, here in the office, gosh, sky's the limit. I just assembled a 6.5 PRC just a couple weeks ago, Proof 20-inch Manners that I bought from Jacob. It's kind of a parts gun, really, just kind of leftover stuff. A nice Zermatt TL3 action, and it's really a sweet rifle. So for those guys that are wanting to be able to have the capability to shoot just a little bit further than normal in a hunting situation, what do you guys do different to zero that rifle versus a traditional hunting rifle? And what are some common pitfalls that we've seen in doing so that is going to make them eventually miss their target?
Well, first off, it's going to be the exact same as the factory rifle. You're going to want to start either at that 25 yards or bore sight it. Every single gun starts that way. If it's my $7,000 match rifle, I shoot that zeroing the same way as a $300, Savage Axis setup that you buy off the shelf. It all starts with either a bore sight or shooting at 20, 25 yards to get close.
Okay. So what I've experienced is people get these rifles or build these rifles, and they have, the ballistic know-how, and they have the, Ford off on their phone. They have all these things, and the rifle's capable of shooting good groups at longer ranges, but they'll do those things that you do with the traditional hunting rifle. They'll bore sight it. They'll shoot it at 25. They'll shoot it at 100, but they'll shoot a 3-shot group. Oh, yep, good enough. And then they're off to the races. I got to shoot 500, 600, 800 yards. They don't spend a lot of time focusing on where that rifle is truly zero. They shoot a 3-shot group, roughly call it good at 100 yards, and then they just can't stop but go long. And I love shooting stuff far away too. But what's different about getting a better zero at 100 yards for that precision hunting type aspect?
Yeah, that's any time that you're going to push the limits, push the range out a little bit to where you're going to have to adjust for it with your scope turret or a BDC or whatever you're doing. It drives the importance more and more that your zero actually is zero, like that you're actually correct. And I think Jaden covered this or somebody has, I'm sure, in our podcast with like your ballistic calculator that you're using to get all your dope from.
Yep.
If you tell it I have a 100-yard zero, it forces your zero to be correct. And if your 100-yard zero is actually a half minute high or low, well, that's going to carry through with all the calculations.
A quarter minute, an eighth minute,
right.
And then you throw in wind to that application. Now is your 0 100? Well, you tell it it's 100, but what if it's 115?
Right.
What if it's 97?
Right.
What
And
if it's
same thing, yeah,
130?
left to right. If you have a little bit of a bias and the wind is calling for something, and you're like, okay, well, I'll do that. But then, yeah, you're that bias is going to stay there. Your zero errors that exist at whatever zero range you have is just going to carry through linearly through everything that you do, every distance. So for that kind of thing, I'll shoot 10 shots for a zero at a minimum. I mean, obviously,
Again, more is better, but so, and I would agree with you. I think 10 shots, you know, if we're talking practical ranges, and this is not a podcast to talk about what is practical as far as long range shots on a animal go, but you know, inside of a half a mile, 800 yards or so I would encourage listeners to explore zero angle, which we'll talk about in our precision rifle here in just a couple minutes. But explore zero angle. We outlined it really well in our Ford Off podcast. If you have continued questions, we'll continue to answer them because it is the way and the light. But for, let's say the majority of shots going to be sub 500, certainly sub 600. There's a very small percentage that might occur after that. And everybody wants to romanticize about long range shots, you know, while hunting. Reality is most of them occur sub 500 or certainly sub 600. Yep. It's great to be prepared, but for those shots, you can still use a zero range. Yep. You can still be effective. You just want to have a better idea of what that range exactly is. So you're saying you shoot 10 shots. So with a carbon fiber barrel, for example, or a steel hunting weight barrel, how do you guys zero those in regard to barrel heat? Because that's a concern.
It's the same. It's the same thing with both of those, I would say. Well, I mean, because you're going to have a mix of. Still, you're in that realm of where you can get button rifle barrels that may or may not be ideally stress relieved. Even some of the carbon wrap stuff is still a button rifle barrel that we've seen heat cause issues with.
So, well, they'll want to walk on
it.
Yeah.
And even some of the nicer cut rifle carbon wrap barrels don't shoot as well as they could if you keep hammering rounds through them.
And it's all heat.
Yeah, it's heat related.
I've got a pretty slick 7 PRC. It's got a real skinny fluted HS barrel, and that thing I'll shoot 3 or 4 shots, then I'll just put it aside and let it cool for 20 minutes, and then I'll come back and shoot 3 or 4 more shots into the group. Because I've seen that rifle. If I let it cool in between, that rifle will shoot about 1.25 minutes. If I just pound 10 rounds out of it, it's going to shoot 2 minutes, 2.25 minutes. It's just, that's a lot of heat going through a really small barrel.
And that's the other thing too. Like the hunters are going to be more apt to have Magnum cartridges that are going to
more powder.
Heat things up even quicker.
Yeah. So. And they're more apt to shoot less shots in the field, right? So that you don't want to simulate your zero based on a situation you're rarely going to experience, which is a hot barrel.
Yeah. And that's something too to pay attention to, especially for hunters, because that's an entirely first round hit centered. Is to look for if there is any difference between cold bore or what, your first shot. If your first shot of the group is always, like the one that tends to be the high right one, well, maybe you need to
zero accordingly.
Focus on that one.
Maybe shoot 1 or 2 shots and let it cool, so that way you know exactly where those first few shots are going to hit. Because ideally, you're going to be taking 1 shot and you have your game animal ethically taken, but there's situations 2 or 3 is definitely on the table to get that thing down. So, shoot what you would expect to be your max rounds to get something down ethically.
Right. And I think Jaden outlined this as well in several podcasts, but what he does on a hunting rifle, similar to what we all do, I like to shoot a 3-shot group with my 7 PRC or my 6.5 PRC, for example. I have 6.5 Creedmoors. I'll shoot a 5-shot group, no problem. But you're burning significantly less powder, 30 or 40% less powder than a big Magnum, right? So, but I'll shoot a 3-shot group, say with my 7 PRC, let it cool, come back on the same target, same condition, same day. I just let it cool, and I'll take that same point of aim, and put 3 more shots into that group. And I'll do that until I have either 9 or 12 shots there.
Yep. And, not everybody has the benefit of having a range at work like we do where we can do that throughout the whole day. But, say a guy goes out to the range and you're planning on doing exactly that. We'll bring like a 223 or a 22 so you can shoot your 3 shots with your hunting rifle. You can mess around with something else while that cools off. So that way you're not sitting. Yeah, barricade practice. That'd be, a really good time use there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to just sit there and twiddle your thumbs for half an hour between shots. Just, figure out something else to do if you're going to spend your Saturday getting your hunting rifle set up, and you want to spend that time up front making sure everything is just dead nuts ready to go, because say you've got an $8,000 elk hunt, you want to make sure that thing is ready to go. You don't want to waste time doing a 3-shot group saying, oh, it's good to go, and then assume you're good out to 800 yards if you had to.
Yep.
It's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say for like that long range or whatever, longer range hunting setup is you're getting into the realm where you're going to have to start testing your equipment a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would run your turrets out and run them back in. And then so maybe you get your good 15 shot zero at 100 and you're happy with how that is. Spend the rest of the day running it out to range, but then at the end of the day, come back after you've adjusted everything back to 0 and verify your 0.
That's a great point. You need to know your equipment. You need to know, one, what your cone of fire is. Do you have a 1-minute rifle, which in large scale is somewhat rare, contrary to manufacturers, half-minute guarantee and stuff. To have a true 1-minute rifle that will always produce 1 MOA is saying something. But you want to know what that cone of fire is.
You can do that. That's pretty.
every-
I'd say that's pretty reasonable for some of those higher end hunting rifles.
Right.
Like,
Yep.
Yeah.
But it is very important to know that, because say, I know my 7 PRC shoots 1.25 minutes. Well, I can use that to give myself kind of a rough idea of where it is an ethical, limit to my distance on the shot taken. Say, is it 600? Well, how big are the vitals at 600? Am I still keeping all of my shots within that?
Mhm.
Or is it starting to get outside there where my shot placement might not be as good? So it is really important to know the capabilities of your rifle system for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And especially good for chasing your tail downrange.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if you're 500 yards out and you have one that goes, a little bit higher than you would think it should, but then as you keep shooting, the whole group is just a little bigger than you'd like it to be, but it's centered where you want it to be. I mean, it's better to know that than to adjust off that first round that went a little bit higher, a little bit low.
Exactly.
Yep.
So it's just a little bit more refinement, a little bit more attention. And I think back to a couple years ago, I had an elk hunt in Colorado, and I was shooting a 190 grain CX bullet. They were hand loaded in a 300 Win Mag. They were doing, I forget the velocity. Either way, 190 grain CX bullet. And I had been shooting this rifle leading up to the hunt. It was an industry event, and I received the rifle, I think, in August, and it was a late October hunt. So I had plenty of time to get familiar with this rifle. And I hand loaded for it because we don't make the 190 CX available in 300 Win Mag ammo because it's too long of a bullet for SAMI specs. But I could hand load it, and it would work. And this rifle is a factory Savage 300 Win Mag in their impulse, nice fluted barrel. And I'll tell you what, that rifle is probably one of the more accurate factory rifles I've ever shot, and more so, probably the most accurate 300 Win Mag I've ever shot that had presumably a standard SAMI chamber. Anyways, I'd spent all of September and August and the better part of October preparing for this hunt and shooting this rifle, and I did exactly that. I did 2 5-shot groups. I could get away with it. It would pound 5-shot groups with these 190 CXs, just wad them up. So I had a 10-shot 0 and practiced and stretched the legs. And when it came down to it, it came down to the 5th day of the hunt, 20 minutes before the sun went down. And there's one shot opportunity, the only shot opportunity that I'd had in the 5 days at 720 yards. Was able to look at Ford off. I watched the wind for 10 minutes before the shot, and I knew exactly the impact velocity I was going to have, and was super confident, almost to the point of not arrogance, but I was prone with a rifle system that I knew really, really well, and was able to take that shot and put it exactly where I wanted to, and that was very confidence inspiring in hindsight to know that I did all the homework that I could and that I had a good 0 and I wasn't just 3 or 5 shots. And if I missed, was it me? Was it the wind? Or was it I just had the wrong 0?
Right.
Yeah, that is a perfect situation to show you did all of your work up front and you know what the rifle's capable of. You've practiced with it, so you're confident with it, and you had success because of it.
Yep.
It's a really good situation.
Awesome.
Out here, you may only get one chance. So never compromise. At any distance. Match accurate ELDX bullets, highest BCs, flat trajectories, and unparalleled terminal performance at all practical ranges. Precision Hunter ammunition from Hornady.
Well, I mentioned Ford off. I wanted to bring this up. We'll talk about it here with the PRS and competitive rifle zeroing. But in regard to hunting rifle and kind of precision hunting, if you're using a Hornady bullet or any bullet from most of the major manufacturers out there, and it's in Ford off, you guys need to be, as a listener, you need to be doing yourself a service. Download the app. It's free. You will hit what you're aiming at more often than using some traditional BC-based calculator that's going to have errors. And one of the things that Ford off allows you to do is use a zero angle, which we'll talk about here. If your bullet that you're shooting is not in Ford off, we still offer a BC-based calculator that has something called atmospheric zero, and it allows you to establish your zero in the crosswinds that you're experiencing at the time you zero. And that's a big deal because you are shooting in a crosswind, and that's going to affect your bullet even as close as 100 yards, and that can affect your zero range if you're still using the zero range. So that's something I wanted our listeners to be aware of.
Yeah, so that kind of comes back to how Miles had mentioned, if you're off a little bit left or right, or if there's a crosswind. The reason why that might be off a little bit is you have things like aerodynamic jump and obviously wind drift and spin drift that are affecting the bullet. So if you're just assuming that your bullet crosses dead nuts at 100 yards, that's what your app is saying. So if I shot and I zeroed at a 3-mile-an-hour wind, and then I came out to the range a different day, and it's 10-mile-an-hour wind, well, the app is still going to assume that it's going dead nuts through the center. And everybody knows that's just not true because you have different wind, you'll have a little bit of different aerodynamic jump, and a bunch of other things involved with that. So what atmospheric zero and zero angle will do for you is you'll measure all of those atmospheric conditions. So your altitude, pressure, temperature, humidity, and very important, your wind conditions. And you'll tell the app, this is what the environment was doing when I zeroed, and then the app will spit out a number in the form of an angle as well as a windage offset that will correspond with that. So now you're telling the app, in these conditions, my bullet went here. So when, a really good example is we live at like 1,600 foot elevation. You go out to out west and you're at 4, 5, 6, thousands of feet elevation higher than we are here. Well, your zero is going to be a little bit different because your atmospheric conditions are different.
Sure.
And that will also compensate for it as well. Because how many guys you hear, well, I zeroed my rifle, out in Nebraska, whatever, and I go out to Wyoming shooting prairie dogs or whatever, and my zero's way off. Well, that's part of it is your atmospheric conditions have changed, and the app is still assuming that you're going at, dead nuts at 100 yards, when in reality, that's not happening.
Right on.
So, yeah.
If you're using a BC calculator and you notice every time you go to shoot, your zero is a little bit different, maybe try Ford off.
Yeah.
Yep. So now shifting gears into the competitor, right? So now you've got really high-end rifles. You really need to know where that bullet is crossing your line of sight so that you can make accurate corrections for downrange hits. And man, you look at the top 5, sometimes the top 10 finishers of a national level PRS match, 1 or 2 hits might separate 5 competitors.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's hyper competitive. And so how do you guys go about zeroing your precision rifles?
We've got some cool acoustic targets that allow us to cheat.
Yeah.
But we plug 20 or 30 rounds at a known distance and known conditions, and those acoustic targets pick up the shot extremely precisely. So we can differentiate where each bullet hole is, and we have an Excel we can generate an Excel spreadsheet printout of it, and then we can go in and manipulate that data. But to find exactly where it is relative to where we were aiming, and get our zero angle set up really true to the average point of impact.
Yeah. And the stuff that we use, it's called Shot Marker, made by Auto Trickler, but there's a lot of products in the market available to everybody. So it's not like just something that we've got.
Yeah.
But I was going to say the way to do that same thing without the shot marker or whatever is to do a dot drill, and you just aim dead center, get a dot drill target that has just 1 inch or half-inch dots, whatever you want, but you got 20 or 25 of them on a sheet of paper, and you hold exactly the same point of impact.
Same point of aim.
Or same point of aim, yeah. Same point of aim on every single one of those, and you just go through, and then you can measure them all individually, and then find where the average point of impact is, and then that's what you'll feed into whatever. If your ballistic calculator allows you to have an elevation and a windage offset, or you do your zero angle on forward off based off of that average point of impact of
then
a large sample of shots at a known distance in known conditions.
And then, of course, we've got group analysis within
That's a
Forward-Off
big
app.
one. Yeah.
So that's, you shoot your group of 10, 20, however many shots you want.
But we highly recommend no less than 10.
Yeah. No less than 10 will get you at least more accurate than the people shooting 3s and 5s. You're going to have some errors in your dispersion because of that. But yeah, you'll measure out every single impact's XY coordinates and get your average impact location. And then you'll go in and you'll set your zero angle based off of that. And it's really nice using zero angle, because how many times have you seen guys that are, their zero is either just a little left or a little right. It's in between clicks on turrets, and it just drives people nuts. Well, you can just go into the app and tell the app, like, I hit 1/10 of a mil right, and it'll correct it for you.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think to rewind a little bit, precision rifle zeroing starts just like the package rifle zeroing. Bore sight it, shoot it at 25.
Go through, make sure everything's tight.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
you can't escape that.
Yeah, we've never seen that happen before.
You can throw more money at it, but you can't escape the basics.
So you get at least a 10. A lot of us shoot 20s. I know some guys shoot 30s.
Yeah. I usually shoot a 30 for my match gun. You shoot 20 or 30 usually, right?
Yeah. So the more the merrier there, because it helps you get an idea of where the true center of your cone of dispersion lies.
Right.
And then,
and I guess a point on that, because we're, yammering on about it, but the point is that you have a shot cloud. If I'm at 800 yards, right, then there's the level of dispersion has spread out enough that, like, the rifle, if I bolted it down to a 2,000-pound stone and just fired 1,000 rounds through it, I'm going to have a cone of fire, okay? And there's a dispersion to that. There's like a profile to that. Most of them are going to hit closer to the center, and then as you get further out, you have less and less probability. But if this is the center of my target, this is where I'm aiming, and I shift that down 1/10 of a mil, you think, 1/10 of a mil at 800 yards, who cares? It's like 2-point-something inches, 3 inches, right? Who cares? I'm shooting at a 1.5 minute plate, I'm shooting at whatever, right? What's 3 inches? Well, you took that whole cloud of your possible hits and you move it down, and it turns out, if you look at it, you can slice away 10 to 15, sometimes 20% of your hit probability, of your first round hit probability can get wiped away by being 1/10 of a mil off.
Yeah. So it really matters on the long range stuff. And, granted, wind is usually the biggest error, but that all adds up together. Yeah, I mean, if you take 7 to 20% out because you're 1/10 off or 1/10 off on your zero, and then you also add you're off 2 to 3 mile an hour on your wind call, that number is not going to get better because you're off on your wind call. It's just going to continue to get worse.
Right.
Yeah. And so it just depends. It's application dependent how much that matters to you. Because like I said, the guy that's shooting an 8-inch kill zone on a deer at 200 yards, if he's half a click off, who cares?
Yeah.
But if you're shooting at like a 1 minute of angle target,
KYL rack,
right? A KYL rack or a 1.5-minute target out to 1,200 yards, then it absolutely matters.
Yep. And that zero angle that we use in Forward Off is so great because we've all seen this. You show up to the match, it's Friday, everybody's on the zero range, everybody's tweaking their stuff. And you know that they were tweaking their stuff before they left for the match. And now they're retweaking it now because they're chasing what they think is zero because they're stuck on zero range.
Right.
And they don't understand that the range is simply an arbitrary distance that in that specific atmospheric condition where it crossed your line of sight.
Yeah.
Where zero angle jumps in, it corrects for all of that. It takes into account that actual departure angle of the line of sight relative to your bore axis, basically, so that you get a environmental zero that is mechanically fixed, and you can't duplicate that with a zero range.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
the
it's
only way to screw it up is to bump your scope internals around or bump
Yeah.
your barrel around.
Yeah.
I think it is fair to say, like, a lot of those guys that are tweaking it before every match on the Friday before, they're still seeing success because those conditions aren't changing that much from when they zero to the next day for that weekend, because they're all in the same location. Biggest factor at that point is wind. But I don't know, probably the last 5 or 6 matches, I hadn't even taken my gun out of the truck that we showed up to. Like, I shot a match, it was 2 weeks ago in Indiana, left my gun at the hotel for the registration day, and I ended up shooting relatively well for me. I shot like 77% impacts, and I'm typically a 60-65% impact kind of guy. And I didn't have to mess with my stuff because my zero angle was set. I didn't shoot a zero. I didn't go out and shoot steel to make sure everything was good. I knew as long as my equipment didn't get damaged, I was going to be good to go. And it was.
And I think the other thing that people chase around is that a lot of the BC-based solvers don't handle aerodynamic jump very well.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And not to diverge into a whole tangent there.
Well,
but
it's worth noting because wind, when present, affects your bullet at distances as close as 100 yards.
Right.
And most BC-based solvers don't account for aerodynamic jump, period. The applied ballistics solver does, but it's an empirical-based formula that often over-exaggerates the effects of aerodynamic jump.
Yeah, it takes some generalizations of it because it doesn't have the true inertias or the model of the bullet. So it has to makes a lot of assumptions that, for the most part gets you pretty close. But if you want what it actually happens, you're going to have a model of the bullet with the CG locations. All of the physical relationships of the bullet are involved in Ford off. So it's not just a shot in the dark or an assumption. It's what the actual values are.
And again, just for listeners at home, if just pay attention when you go out and shoot and check zero. But if you notice, oh hey, wind's coming left to right one day and I zero, okay. And when you go out to shoot again, see is the wind coming left to right, right to left, head on, tailwind, and see you'll see those little differences where if I zeroed with just a little bit of a headwind, or if I zeroed when it was perfectly calm, and then you get those different wind conditions. Try it at 100 yards and watch. Your wind will change just a little bit, but then your elevation you'll see a tenth or two up or down. Along with that, it's just something for people. A lot of people aren't even aware of it, honestly. Right. And so it's just something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, I've been to quite a few matches where somebody in my group is using a BC solver, and say we've got a left to right wind all day, and he kind of struggles for the first few stages. Then he gets his dope figured out. Well, now the wind is coming from right to left, and all of a sudden he's got issues again. That's probably because it's not handling aerodynamic jump properly.
Right. I would say for the listeners out there, certainly the competitors out there that are listening, it's the 21st century. Get with the times and use a modern calculator that actually has the exact physical model plus the drag coefficients and everything that goes along with it in a free app. Ford off. It's simply the future, and the future's now. You don't have to struggle with the problems that using a simple BC based solver generates.
Just because it costs more doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
Yeah, it's one of those things it's hard. Okay, yeah, I get it. I work at Hornady. I wear the Hornady shirt. But that's one of those things that is like a legitimate good thing that I'm wholesale sold on.
It's advanced the industry. It really has.
Because you can see, okay, I set this up. As long as you set your profile up exactly, correctly, then it's a robust system, and there's no more screwing around with it.
One of the things that really resonates with me, certainly, I saw Ford off from its infancy to where it's at now, and I used BC-based calculators, the same ones everybody else is still using, and had the same problems everybody else is experiencing. One of the things that resonates the most is you always hear garbage in, garbage out. You put bad data in, you'll get bad data out. Okay, well, with a BC-based solver, you can give it all the data that you know as accurately as you can possibly measure it, and you still get bad data out until you finger it enough to make things jive for a window of time or your environment.
Yeah.
But with Ford Off, you put good data in, you get good data out. And that's one of the things that always, like I said, resonated with me as Ford Off became more and more prominent and easy to use was you actually put good data in, you actually get good data out versus
and
the
you
BC
see,
stuff.
well, and that's the funny thing too, is you see people trying to use the old tricks with
Oh,
Ford
yeah.
Off, and it's like, no. If you just measured your muzzle velocity with a good chronograph, like
Yeah.
a Labrate or something, you know what that is.
Yeah, that's the last thing you want to be messing with.
leave
You
that
know what
alone.
the value
like,
is.
You
Yeah.
100% leave that alone.
Yeah, you
And
almost need like a
figure
ruler,
out
like
you have
Catholic
yeah,
school. Pow!
Yeah,
I
right?
mean-
you have something else in there that is wrong, whether it's
Yeah.
your sight over bore or something else is.
Yeah. Anybody can sit in a BC solver and mess with your muzzle velocity and your BC value until you get a number that matches up at your 800 yard dope. But what happens the next day when it's 30 degrees different or your wind is totally different? Oh shoot, your stuff's all messed up again.
Yep.
And now you got to tune or tweak it again. Like
Yeah.
just measure everything you can up front. So you sight height, muzzle velocity, mean point of impact. Like those are all things you can physically measure really easily. Shoot out to 800,000 yards, adjust your form factor, and you're done. You don't need to mess with it.
Don't
You're good to
touch it.
go. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't touch it.
Yeah. Well, before we continue to beat this dead horse, let's shift gears to the last thing I want to talk about, which is thermal.
The Hornady Auto Charge Pro, providing precise, customizable powder dispensing in an easy-to-use, space-saving unit. The new modernized load cell is precise to within 0.1 grain. The Auto Charge Pro offers customizable trickle speeds for various powder types, as well as custom trickle time settings. With a smaller footprint than competing brands, the Auto Charge Pro still offers a large powder capacity hopper. The Auto Charge Pro from Hornady.
For me and a lot of other people, just now at like the entry level, but you guys very experienced in thermal. So I'd be curious to hear how you guys set up your thermal and how you zero that.
I guess I'm lucky enough that the resolution on mine is usually good enough. I can see steel plates at the little local range that lets us shoot at night there. So you can actually, you can see the steel, and then when you shoot it, you can see the hot spot from where you hit.
Wow.
So that's usually the way I'll go about it, but barring that, you can take like paper targets and staple a hand warmer to the point of
I
impact.
still do that. Even
Yeah.
And that's there's nothing wrong with that at
Yeah.
all. That's probably the most solid way to go.
At what range are you doing this?
Depends on the application. I'm more apt to do the point blank range 0 with thermal stuff because there's not really a good way to get range.
Yeah, it's really difficult to tell how far stuff is with thermal.
Yeah. So mostly it's by gosh and by golly, yeah, he looks like he's within 200. Let's take the shot.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll set it up with like a 200 yard, 220 yard, something like that, 0. So that
Yeah. And so you're using the hand warmer as well?
Yep. So I usually use the hand warmer. Very similar because again, shooting at night, distance is hard to tell. You also want to make sure you hit what you're shooting at, so you're not going to take shots too far. So I stick with kind of the max point blank 0 type approach as miles. I usually set up a hand warmer on a big clean sheet of cardboard at 50 to 75 yards at home, and I'll shoot a couple shots, and I'll go up there and I'll measure how far off it is, and I'll adjust my thermal sight until it is as close to center as I can. And then I like to back up to 100 yards, shoot a steel plate that's clean, so I can see right where it's impacting. So I know, if I see a coyote at 100 yards, this is about where I should expect it to hit. And if I have the time or the opportunity to go shoot 300 or 400 yards just to see worst case where that's going to be, and I'll tweak that up and down just to make it so I've got as flat a fire as possible. So that way I know I can hit everything from 10 yards to 200 without really having to mess with holdovers.
Right on. I haven't done this personally, but I have heard of this being done. Aluminum tape.
Yeah.
Just a roll of aluminum tape. You can cut it, make an X or a square or a box or whatever you want.
Yep.
Tape that to your target, and that gives you a really good aiming point as well.
And
thermal's great for finding cans in the ditch.
Yeah.
Just because, all that metal stuff, it reflects it. I don't know. It has like a sheen to it. Looks like it's reflected in sunlight too.
And if you're lucky, sometimes the conditions are just like magically perfect. And if you've got a piece of paper for your target that's got some pretty different colors on it, like you got a white with a pretty heavy black center dot or something, sometimes you can see it. It just really depends on the conditions.
That's true. A lot of times you can sight the thermal in the daytime.
Yeah.
If you get like the high contrast NRA targets that are white with a black bowl, the black bowl will collect heat, and you can see that.
Interesting.
Yep. Yeah, if you just put up a fresh sheet, and a lot of times you can see it. It just kind of depends on the thermal and the conditions.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. You guys do a max point blank range kind of deal, and range estimation way harder at night. Pulsar, for example, has thermal range finders, but they just get more expensive. And are they really? It's a great product. I've used one. It's absolutely fantastic. But for the guy just trying to shoot some raccoons during fur harvest season or shoot coyotes or something, unless you're really into it, if you're doing competitions, in Texas, fur or coyote competitions, fox competitions are thousands upon thousands of dollars over the winter. So maybe there, but max point blank range, effective. You guys sight your stuff in at a closer range and stretch the legs out.
I think around here too, we kind of get boxed into the size of a cornfield. Most of our ranges are limited to that anyway.
So it's absolutely a kind of close enough game for that stuff for me anyways, because it's, if I can hit an 8-inch plate standing at 100 yards, or if I can hit a 6 or an 8-inch plate at 300 off a tripod, I'm happy because I'm going to kill everything I shoot.
Yeah, and the dogs tend to be a little bit more brazen at nighttime. So you put the call on. It's not always that difficult to get them to break that 300-yard line.
Yeah,
everything behaves a little differently at night.
We've got a coyote at 400 yards, but that was pretty lucky. Everything else has been well within 150 yards.
Yeah,
awesome. Well, thanks for walking us through how you guys would zero rifles and how not to do a rifle zero. Before I let you guys go, I can't remember asking you guys, so I got to throw it out there. Jacob, if you had to pick one cartridge and one bullet for the rest of your life, what are you picking?
One cartridge, one bullet?
Unlimited ammo, unlimited guns.
For everything, matches, hunting, everything?
You name it.
Man, it'd probably have to be a 6.5 Creedmoor. And if I wanted to hunt, I'd probably pick a 143 LDX. If I just wanted to shoot general stuff, 147 ELDM.
Yeah. Well, you got to pick one, so the 143 it is.
Yeah, I guess it'd be probably about a 13, 14-pound 6.5 Creedmoor with 143s.
You could have 27 rifles.
Oh, well, in that case, I'd have a 10-pound Creedmoor, and I'd have a 20-pound Creedmoor shooting 143 ELDX.
Awesome, easy. Miles, the internet needs to know. What are you going to pick?
I'm really torn. I want the 6mm arc to work, but I don't think it's got enough juice for some of the bigger stuff I'd like to hunt. So I'm probably in that same world. I'll probably do 6.5 Creedmoor with 143.
Not a 6.5 PRC. Go and stick it with the Creedmoor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Creedmoor's does everything.
Yeah, and it's not very labor intensive as far as maintenance goes.
The 143 you can shoot matches with. I don't think I'd have any problems there.
You shot
a couple
matches
people
with
that have. Yeah, you have.
And then that's just enough bullet to get into the game with the right shot. The game that most of the time it's deer and smaller, but occasionally if I wanted to do a closer range shot at an elk or something, I think it'd handle it.
Another interesting thing: how many 6.5 Creedmoor rifles, like factory rifles, have you seen shoot poorly? Because I can count on one hand.
There was one very economical rifle that an employee ordered. I believe the brand out here, but it showed up and it did not shoot at all. Turns out there was no rifling in it.
Yeah.
Exchanged that with the manufacturer for one that was rifled, and you've got a $350 gun that shoots a minute.
I've seen a lot of really cheap, economical 6.5 Creedmoor factory rifles just wad them up. It's great.
Yeah, it is great. Awesome. Well, great choices, guys, and thanks again for walking us through how not to zero a rifle and how to zero your rifles.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yep.
All right, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast and found it at least a little bit educational on some things we do to zero the rifles. To quote the Big Lebowski, this is just like our opinion, man. But there are some helpful tips in here. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the next one.